Good afternoon. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. So, good afternoon to everybody. We are here this afternoon to listen to 3 papers. The discussion will be very short because we are going to be very punctual on time. So, the 3 people who will present this afternoon, more or less, the first 2 of them at least, will speak about different aspects of ancient Greek music and performance. And so I call here Alex Silverman, the first one.
Hi.
Yeah. Hi. Alex Silverman is an award-winning musician and classicist who has studied at Cambridge, Bristol and Oxford. He has been composer and music director for the Cambridge University Greek plays since 2010 and contributes to performance and research projects at APGRD. Alex teaches at Jesus College, from which come most of his supporters, and where he is a part-time doctoral student researching the reception of ancient dramatic choruses in music, and a founder member of ancient music at Oxford, AMO, which in Italian sounds very, very lovely. So, this afternoon he will speak about ancient Greek choral odes and the invention of North American classical music.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for offering me this opportunity to present at a wonderful conference. I'm going to talk to you today, eventually, about the work of 2 composers of the 19th century whose music responded to the choral odes of ancient Athenian drama. Those composers are John Knowles Paine and his score for the production of Oedipus Tyrannos at Harvard in 1881, and Hugh Archibald Clarke's music for Aristophanes' Arcanians at the University of Pennsylvania in 1886. So this will be, and I say this by way of a sort of content warning for those of you at the hardcore end of the philological spectrum, a reception study. However, I will reassure you there will also be plenty of discussion of Greek meter, because who doesn't love dogmiacs? So something for everybody today. And importantly, the issues of memory and identity are both critical to my paper this afternoon. These pieces, keystones really in a classical drama boom of the 1880s, which encompassed productions especially in universities across the Anglosphere but also in Europe, contributed to the fabrication of a shared perception of ancient performance culture, one which purports to keep alive the memory of ancient drama by re-performing it. They are also in turn shaped by more recent memory of other performances, and I'm going to argue that one production in particular haunts these works and is influential in how they go on to reinterpret ancient music. As scholars of ancient music, we know that the chorus who asks the question "Tide me choroeoein," or why am I dancing, is also challenging its own audience with a more important question. That would be, who are we? The answer in Antiquity and in modern receptions, I suggest, is best approached by studying the songs that chorus sings. And both Paine's Oedipus and Clarke's Arcanians included choral odes sung in ancient Greek.
They were performed by students, first in front of their peers, and subsequently, in both cases, before large public audiences in New York. And as such, those choral odes are fertile places to explore the projection of American identity, that of the composers, the performers, and their audiences in the 1880s, through songs which reflect, by preserving the text of Sophocles and Aristophanes, ancient Greek musical design. So here's two men with fantastic facial hair, and some other things to recommend them. The background is this. In 1875, John Knowles Paine on the left and Hugh Archibald Clarke on the right were appointed as the first professors of music in the United States at Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania, respectively. There's no agreement on which one came first, and the fact that I cannot tell you, definitively at least, tells us that when it comes to these two musicians and their work, the archival record is quite sketchy. It also tells us that these appointments were significant in as much as both institutions would like to claim that they were the first to include music in their academic curriculum. For both men, composing music for a Greek play was very high on the list of jobs they had to do after they were appointed. Outside of the academy, musical life in late 19th century America was busy and heavily Eurocentric. So the roots of that Eurocentrism can be ascribed to a couple of events. In particular, in 1822, Thomas Hastings' Dissertation on Musical Taste is the first full musical treatise by an American-born author, and its premise was simple, urging American composers to give up folk-based traditions and turn instead to a more scientific German style of writing music. From that point, obviously, there is a constant flow of immigrants from mainland Europe to the New World, which continues up until, well, it continues today, and continued to shape the taste of an emerging musical nation and inflect it with European style. Opera houses have started appearing in the middle of the 19th century in the States, which prioritize Italian companies, but also host American premieres of French and German romantic repertoire and attract vast audiences. There is almost no demand for homegrown American music in these places. There are a few adaptations by naturalized composers such as Reinagel and Pellissier, but only very occasionally. And in general, the market for concert music and dramatic music on a large scale, we can say it's proven and healthy, but it is still European. There is widespread and long-standing demand for participation as well as consumption of music. Just a month after the first production of Clarke's piece, in Massachusetts, the Old Staunton Music Society, I'm probably pronouncing that right, wrong, celebrated its centenary, so 100 years of people playing together, with a performance of Haydn's Creation. So outside of the metropolitan hubs, there is a thriving amateur music making ecology by the 1880s in the States, but that is modeled on and mirrors European practice to a large degree. Again, at the heart of that thriving music scene is repertoire by composers born and trained outside of the United States, principally because there aren't the places to train them. Not every European import was a hit. In the April of 1845, a notorious production of Antigone opens in New York. That show featured music composed by Mendelssohn for his patron Friedrich Wilhelm IV in Potsdam in 1841, and it had already by this point enjoyed considerable success in Berlin, Hamburg, Leipzig, Munich, Paris, London, and Dublin. In New York, it just didn't work. Fiona McIntosh has argued that the identity of the chorus was absolutely central to this failure. Antigone was staged at Palmo's Theatre. There's a picture of it slightly later behind me. And that had initially been established as a home for opera. It was a favorite with the Manhattan elite who enjoyed the offer of fine dining Italian singers. Good combination. The venue had recently changed hands, and the new owner, William Dinaford, was intent on broadening the repertoire to include plays too. He sacked the Italian chorus and hired in their place 40 German-trained, German-speaking singers, who then struggled to perform the choral odes from Mendelssohn's piece in English for an English-speaking audience. There's a picture of this painted by Vandenhoff, who says that they sang underconfidently with their backs to the audience and copies of the score stuck to their noses. So for an underwhelmed and dwindling audience, and who literally left in droves, the chorus were bluntly the wrong people for the job. The deficiency of their identity was exacerbated by their poor execution of the music. It was also a function of their failure to tell a story effectively to an audience who expected a different group of people to occupy that theatrical space. We might think then that John Knowles Paine was taking a bit of a risk when he came to compose his Oedipus Tyrannus of 1881 with a chorus singing odes in ancient Greek. The precedent tells us that Sophocles plus an orchestral score plus a chorus singing in the wrong language equals flop. But his audience at Harvard was somewhat more sympathetic, and the subsequent revival in New York was received rapturously. So Elson, the early historian of music in America, describes that as the greatest composition which up to that time had been written in this country. And this success apparently derives from the musical treatment of choral odes and how Paine's composition responds to the musicality of Sophocles' play. He goes on, he allowed himself to be inspired by the loftiness of the text, and here are the key musical facets of that: unison, harmony, counterpoint, merely as they evolve themselves from the tragedy and not with any preconceived attempt at a system. And that's quite a grand claim, and one that makes a lot of assumptions about ancient music, which we can investigate by looking at a short choral passage. So I'm going to, in a second, stand by, Sharunas, I'm going to play a short excerpt from Paine's setting of the fourth Stasimon of Oedipus Tyrannus. Here's the text as he set it. And this passage has everything that you would expect and want in a tragic choral ode. So the chorus are bemoaning Oedipus's fate as they come to terms with and underscore for us the scale of his transgression. It's musically very evocative. We've got eors, so wailing noises that are an invitation possibly to vocal elaboration or ornamentation or repetition. The central image of Jocasta as a harbour, which Oedipus has visited as child and husband, coincides with a run of what I enjoy as hypodochmiac metra. Here they are. O megas limen autos herkesen paidi kai patri. So there's a rhythm that's unsettling. You get three of them in a row. That gives you consecutive long syllables that hold us back and then push us off in another direction. And it gives you a creative urgency, I guess, and greater intensity. The musical repetition of this rhythm in the Greek explicitly mirrors Oedipus's multiple interactions with Jocasta as a son sent away, as a lover returning, and as a king facing the consequences of his actions. There's lots going on here. So we're going to hear just less than a minute of how Paine sets this passage. Are you standing by? Fantastic. Now let's try. Thank you. I'm worried about. Oh no, there we go. Good. So even in that short excerpt, we can check off some of the elements that Elson admired in Paine's work. We've got voices singing in unison, are a central feature, and as you might expect, when a chorus is many members are addressing Oedipus as one on stage, but they branch out into 2, 3, and 4-part harmony, and you can see that top left. Their staggered entries and harmonic suspensions give us the impression of counterpoint. It's not true counterpoint, even though the vocal writing is mostly monophonic. There's plenty of textural variation in the orchestral accompaniment, which supports the chorus in some places, punctuates and answers it in others. You can see the sort of staccato stabs underpinning the vocal lines there. To what extent is that rhythm evolved from tragedy, as Elson put it? Well, thank you for asking. We can measure that, as you would with any ancient musical document, I suggest, by scanning it. So here we go. This methodology raises a lot of interesting questions, which I don't have time to address, but I'll happily talk to you about later. But to explain as briefly as possible, the metrical scheme given in red above the score, you can just about see that. Thank you, Zoom. That measures in a binary form that we're familiar with, the language of ancient metrics or prosody, the relative lengths of the notes assigned by Payne to the Greek text in the context of each musical phrase. These bars of music contain the three hypodokmiacs I was talking about earlier, and their meter, the shape suggested by the long and short syllables of the Greek, is given underneath in green. So you can compare Sophocles' rhythm to the rhythm ascribed by Payne, and you can see that Payne's not really following the Greek meter that assiduously. He's introducing regular variations, and that pattern is repeated across the strophe. Here's the whole thing. So I've juxtaposed here the meter of the Greek on the left with the relative lengths of the syllables in the orchestral version on the right. And I've highlighted all the places where it doesn't match in grey to help us see the extent of that it follows. Payne's music matches the meter 68% of the time. As it happens, that's 47 out of those 69 syllables match, which sounds like quite a lot. And it's high enough to suggest some interest in the musical content of the verse. He would certainly have had advice on that available to him at Harvard. But the number is not big enough to suggest that the meter is a constraining factor in the design of Payne's music. From analysis that I've undertaken of other modern composers' work, including Mendelssohn's, but also much more recent composers too, where compositions set choral odes in ancient Greek and do use meter as an organizing principle, we would very rarely see less than 90% correlation between these two maps here, matching relative length to those of the metrical scheme. So less than 90% would suggest that it's definitely not a purpose to reflect the meter. Other bits of evidence suggest that this is not the case here. There is deviation in every line of the strophe, obviously, and it's very inconsistent. So those three hypodokmiac metra are a case in point. That pattern is attractive, it's memorable, it repeats comfortably within a 4/4 rhythmic framework, which is what Payne is using to organize this piece of music. But he disrupts all three of them, and each in a different way. So in the first, he alters the second. In the second, he alters the fifth element, and in the third, he alters the fourth. So that tells us that the composer is making decisions about length of notes on a word-by-word or syllable-by-syllable basis. Zooming back out to take a broader view of the metrical scheme, this shows us that the patterns a philologist might identify in this passage, so broadly iambics and dogmiacs, are just not something that Payne wants to draw attention to or really use in his composition. To this extent, we can see his setting of this ode in particular and his approach more broadly as one that in part aligns with Mendelssohn's Sophocles pieces and in another way diverges from it. They both harness the Greekness of Sophocles and use it to build something which projects their own culture, their identity, and the concerns of their sponsors. But where Mendelssohn lent into the scholarship of particularly of Johann Christian Donner, Payne rejects the text, because for his American music to be distinct from the European tradition, to be authentically music of the New World, it has to reject the memory of Mendelssohn and imbue it with elements of his own identity. We see that especially in moments of structural variation, such as the repetition of this line 1207, Ior klein on oedipou kara. We can imagine why the composer wants to repeat this line. I think you can see that on the screen. It's because two of the four words, that's Ior and oedipou, are immediately recognizable, even if you don't speak Greek. So repeating this line achieves three things, I think, for an audience of the chorus. It reinforces the narrative thrust of this passage. It intensifies the sentiment. Note it's sung first by tenors and only very quietly, and then by the full chorus, which adds volume and impact. Also, this melody spreads up and down in pitch from a unison point, so it occupies greater sonic bandwidth as it goes. And it makes a really strong connection with the audience on a linguistic level. If they don't get it the first time, they may well do the second time around. And as a composer, it's really important. That buys the attention of your audience for what follows. To this extent, the identity of the audience is as influential on the musical design of this modern choral ode as that of its ancient or modern performers. So we'll have a shorter look at the other piece, at Clark's Acharnians, which is somewhat stricter in its observance of meter. And we might reasonably expect that from a composer described by the same historian Elson as a devout formalist whose music was fettered by contrapunctal rule and by an evident desire not to stray from the high road of art. That's a historian who likes the sound of his own voice. It was, and also quite judgy, frankly. It was indeed the stated aim of the producers at the University of Pennsylvania to present the play in as archaeologically correct a manner as possible. Although at that point, no experts in antiquity were involved because there was no Department of Classics at the University of Pennsylvania in 1886. This didn't impact on its popularity. More than 3,000 people attended the first performance, supposed to be the first performance of any ancient Greek comedy in North America. And like the Harvard Oedipus, it later transferred to New York, where, according to the Philadelphia press, at least, it attracted a greater house than Adelina Patti, the great bel canto singer, who had appeared on the same stage the day before. To get a sense of what they were here to see and how the music of these two productions compares, we're going to look at another choral ode. Very short little strophe from early in the play. There are some similarities with the Oedipus passage. There's a chorus of elders. In this case, they are veterans from Acharni who like war and hate Sparta. That's their entire character. And they are addressing and rebuking a protagonist, Dikaiopolis, who has proposed an innovative way of resolving the city's problems. There are similar metrical components. That's iambics and dochmiacs. Aristophanes deploys dochmiacs here, I think, to comic effect, transposing forms that we recognize from tragic and lyric composers to a much less serious scenario. The tone is heightened, slightly hysterical, and we might expect a fast tempo to convey the insistence of that chorus in their questioning. So a composer could be tempted to draw attention to the curse, or sketlier, you bastard, I suppose, as it's a great word to spit out, and it would sound really impactful and disdainful in the mouths of 24 singers. Here's how it looks once Clark has reworked it. It's a mess. You'll notice this score has much less information than the one of Payne's that I was working from, which was a piano reduction of an orchestral score. Here we've got only vocal lines to work with, and even those are pretty inaccurately recorded. Papyrologists in the room, you may sympathize. In this short sample of 15 measures of music, there are 4 copying errors that I found so far. I've been able to correct those by comparing with other sources and the antistrophe, checking the Greek, which is wrong, and just knowing that the harmony here couldn't have been written by the first professor of music in the United States. Given the state of the score, of course, there is no recording either, but, and lucky for you, Serenos, are you there? Serenos? Yes, I convinced these guys to make one for you. So what do we learn from that, apart from the fact that I have a larger bow tie collection than is healthy? Firstly, and the reason I made that recording, the chorus takes us to a new and possibly unexpected place sonically and harmonically. That is, it takes us right into the world of the glee club. We've got close harmonies. The chorus here, like Payne's, is male voice, so tenor, tenor, bass, bass, but it's strictly monophonic in this instance where we saw a hint of counterpoint before, and it's set really close together on the stage with a sequence of dominant seventh cadences that wouldn't sound out of place in barbershop, hence the awful waistcoats. The use of a ukulele, it's not a small blue kithara, obviously, although it's about as easy to keep in tune, is 100% inauthentic. But its inclusion here is a nod to what the existing musical ecology of the University of Pennsylvania at that time, where there was also a thriving banjo club and mandolin club. Those were the three pillars of musical life in the university. It was a banjo club, a mandolin club, and a glee club. So that is to say, in the years after the appointment of its first professor of the science of music, good title, participation in musical activity includes popular music as well as classical music. At the top of the page here, just to look at the evidence that we do have for how you're supposed to perform this, we have a tempo marking, maestoso, which Italians in the room know means majestic or stately. It suggests to practically a tempo of about 65 beats a minute, but stately really isn't an adjective that we associate with Dochmiac rhythm or meter, which we know is supposed to be wild and frenetic, not stately, not majestic. The meter on the page is observable from the use of time signatures. So the three Dochmiac lines get squeezed into the bars of 3/4 at the top. When we go to iambic meter, the meter of the music becomes 6/8, and there's no indication of how we're supposed to transfer between those two. So recording that, I kept the pulse the same. But that might be the right thing to do. Syllable by syllable, the details of the rhythm do get fudged. Clarke's solution for Dochmiac rhythm, and this is the last example I'm going to show you, is ingenious. He finds a way of simplifying things which my students of meter are terrified of, in a way which preserves their relative lengths and precipitates repeatable phrases that feel plausibly like the vocal idiom in which he's writing. So the normal Dochmiac metron, and I use quotations for normal because we all know there's no such thing as a normal Dochmiac. Anyway, this one gets transposed. So the short elements become 8th and 16th notes. I would call those quavers and semiquavers, and the long elements are represented by longer notes, dotted eighths and quarter notes, with the first long falling always on the first beat of the 3/4 bar. So he manages to make something which is difficult to comprehend for classic students today, relatively easy to sing for non-classic students in 1886. It sounds complicated written out, but just to demonstrate very quickly, it's always going to go short, long, long, short, long, short, long, long, short, long in this version. That doesn't cover anything like the scope of the Dochmiacs in the meter of Aristophanes or indeed in general, but it's a very neat solution to allowing modern music to perform that rhythm. So what's happening on the page is there. In the theatre, where it's played for a vast audience of the great and good of Philadelphia, this music is performing a very similar function to Payne's score before, but with an intriguingly different outcome. Both pieces leverage the musicality of their ancient source to achieve a sound which is new and distinctively American. Clarke's Glee Club-infused choral odes take another longer stride out of the shadow of Mendelssohn. It's the sound of early American popular music, as well as classical music, emerging onto one of the country's grandest stages, where it is legitimized by a newly confident academy and by an audience that is excited to hear itself reflected in those ancient Greek choral odes. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you for your terrific contribution to this conference. And now, if there is any question, please. Yes, please.
I have a question. Oh, thank you. Thank you, that was amazing. I was wondering, I mean, maybe you mentioned and I missed it, but why did they choose tragedies for the first piece that they felt that they felt that they needed to write when they got to the faculty of music, like when they were appointed professors of music, because I think you said they felt the first pieces that they needed to write were tragedies or influenced by.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's a good, we have to change the move verb there, so it's very much chosen for them, I believe. But in the case of the Oedipus at Harvard, I think there are two things going on here. One is obviously the Agamemnon that happened in Oxford in 1880. I can't remember who said this, but I think Paine himself might have said there would have been no Oedipus at Harvard if there hadn't been an Agamemnon at Oxford. So it's about keeping pace with ways of putting a lot of newfound, again, the word archaeological is used in terms of the Arcanians as well. It's about showing what we've suddenly got to show the world on stage, finding a way to bring the classics to a bigger audience in a very explicit way. In Oxford and Cambridge, that was happening with Bells on the productions at Cambridge. Again, I've been involved with those in their later iterations, but the first ones they had to put on special trains so that enough people could get to see them, and the effect when these things happen in the States was exactly the same. I would argue there are two further facets of that. It's a very helpful question, Tira, so thank you. But one is about a corrective measure, which I think Paine plugs right into them. He fills the hole in between Mendelssohn's Antigone, which was a disaster, and his Oedipus at Colonus, which is also pretty disastrous, by this Oedipus Tyrannus. It announces him as a composer working in that sphere. He'd already been performed in Germany, and he was 18 months away from having his first symphony performed. It announces him as a composer working on that scale. So I think it puts him canonically and announces him canonically as a musician. The Arcanians obviously is our earliest remaining Aristophanes text. It's the first performance of an ancient comedy in the States, and it's the one you start with. For Clarke, I believe, so primacy is key, and relationship to Europe, self-definition, canonically and within the academy are both factors there. Thank you.
Yes, please. Two questions, please.
Thank you, that was fascinating. I must confess I haven't known the Mendelssohn piece. I just looked up the video page. It said it was a huge success in Germany apparently, but I don't think it's performed these days. It's very interesting. About the Domians, the Arcanians, I was interested if I heard your performance correctly. You were tripletifying. You were making these rhythms more like triplets. But this is very like the maestoso that it's set more like a march. Why did he set it on maestoso like a march? Is he making fun of Aristophanes?
Well, that would be fun, wouldn't it? Because I would suggest that Aristophanes is mocking tragic rhythm. Is Clarke mocking the comedian, mocking the tragedian? That's one interpretation. He might be misunderstanding. It might be that I think it's a question of, I mean, let's break this down as basically as possible. I'm looking at this page in front of me, and having performed it after a fashion, I can tell you there's a lot of consonants. So in terms of managing the material and the work of the mouth and the breath in these phrases, picking a tempo that allows them to fit in. I mean, it doesn't really work. There's a lot of places in which long syllables get rushed. So I think it is much about trying to pin what the chorus is doing and saying onto relatable local idiom at this point. That is the key compositional choice. It's not one that has anything particular to say about Greek meter, although it does tell us something about Greek meter, which is to say, you can. What I love about this as a way of looking at ancient music, which I maintain is that it describes the possibilities of these rhythmic shapes. It tells us what you can't do, or it tells you what you shouldn't do, but it also tells you what they can do when performed, because the idea that there is a definite way that they were done, for me, piece for the birds. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, this is quite wonderful. A very small correction, which is really indicative of hierarchies in the United States. Kardelis was not the first ancient comedy performed in the United States. The first ancient comedies performed in the United States were F.R.S-FNRS, performed in the Middle West at the University of Michigan and Washington University in St. Louis, and in Jesuit comedies, all of which tend to be ignored because they're not in the hierarchical East and because they're not Washington.
Yeah, noted. Thank you.
Thank you again. And now it's time to listen to Laura Noviello. She is graduated in archaeology at the University of Naples, L'Orientale, and also the master thesis was there. Now she currently is a research fellow of the University of Padua for the national project Musical Ecosystems of Ancient Northern Italy at the University of Padua. Today we will listen to Reliving Pompeii, Vesuvian song culture between continuity and revitalisation.
I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizer of this conference and to all the members of MOISA for having welcomed my proposal, which I am aware was somewhat unconventional. I am honored to have had the opportunity to contribute to such a stimulating conference, so thank you.
Reliving Pompeii, Vesuvian song culture between continuity and revitalization. The reason why I choose this title, I hope will become clear at the end of my presentation. In the middle of In the middle of 18th century, Pompeii and Herculaneum came back to light. The excavation began in 1748, marked a crucial moment in the history of the discovery of ancient world, influencing archaeology, art, and literature in all of Europe. At the time, Naples was one of the most dynamic capitals, suspended between multiculturalism, innovation, and cultural memory, already deeply linked to its past. In this cultural climate, the archaeological excavation introduced a radical change. For the first time, entire Roman cities were discovered, frozen in time, allowing not only the collection of art objects, but also an understanding of daily life as a rich corpus of musical evidences that would be variously received by the different social strata. Thanks to this impulse of thanks to the impulse of this discovery, Naples thus rediscovers its antiquity. The Napolitan and European aristocracies assimilated the fascination of the newly unearthed cities and reproposed attitudes and cultural styles modeled on those of Pompeii. I use the term Pompeii to simplify, but I am, of course, talking about all the sites in the Vesuvian area. One of the most emblematic cases is that of Lady Emma Hamilton, an English model, dancer, actress, wife of the British ambassador to the King of Naples, Sir William Hamilton, volcanologist and famous antiquarian. She was the protagonist of the great artistic and musical revival with her Neo-Pompeian reenactments. The artistic performances that she introduced at court and in the ambassador's Napolitan residence are well known as attitude. real tableau vivant in which she transformed herself into Iphigenia, Medea, Hebe, the Sibyl, or into a Bacchante, or a dance muse performing pantomimes, songs, and dances with traditional drums and idiophones from audiences including Goethe and Vigée-Lebrun. But as we can see, we can see from the picture and from the sources, her model were not just Pompeians, or rather ancient Pompeians. This is a paradigmatic case. In fact, while on the one hand there were an aristocracy that intentionally assimilated the ancient forms, styles, and languages, on the other hand, there were the popular classes who participated directly in the excavation. Napolitan society at times was obviously more complex, I know, but this dichotomy helped us to better understand the issues. The popular classes of the lower classes of artisans and farmers, women, and even children, as a chain of buckets from the Vesuvian area. The modern city of Pompeii was only officially founded in 1928, reappropriates their remote past. But was this just a discovery? To give a reasonable answer to this question, we can focus on music. But first, we should ask one more question. How did these lower classes interact with such an apparently distant dimension? Iconographic, literary, and indeed archaeological sources show us how a number of traditions that would be now called ethnographic, demological, or popular were extraordinarily alive at the time, and even before the start of archaeological excavation and the related neoclassical trends. In the title, I referred to Vesuvian song culture. These require further clarification. The traditional music of the area is actually still part of a communication system based on orality and shows some attractive similarities with ancient Greek and Roman music, especially in the way of learning, execution, and enjoyment of music, but also in terms of musical instrument and occasion of music. This music is closely linked to the sacred dimension, so it is mostly performed during rituals, festivals, and in specific sacred spaces as a devotional practice. And it is possible to say that the greatest assonance is in the continuation of the broader conception of the musique phenomenon. It is still as a simultaneously instrumental, vocal, poetic, and dance language, which always or naturally involve the presence of all of these elements. The performance does not involve the presence of a passive audience, but only a community that shares communication codes with the performers and is familiar with the thousands of verses that the singers perform in ever-changing manner. This complex cultural system has integrated various forms of music over centuries. Therapeutic and possession music, for example, tarantismo in Italian, tarantism, but also sacred and secular music, as you see here in the slide. All these forms have been present in the sources under the name tarantella in Italian since at least 1641. In the writings of the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, in reference to cases of ailing with the music, as you see also here in the Vesuvian area, just near Pompeii. We have not as much time as necessary to reflect on these matters as we should. But we can say that in the Napolitan and Vesuvian area, an autonomous cultural and musical system developed early on with peculiar characteristics and forms particularly attractive to a public in search of exotism and antiquity. It is no coincidence that, as we said before, Lady Hamilton, in order to idly reconstruct the music of ancient Pompeii, wanted to learn the dance to tarantella, or that Goethe wrote about Pompeian dances and tarantellas in Naples. So another question. To what extent the learned gaze of travelers prompted the reworking of the image of the ancient world previously lost and now rediscovered? The construction of a new Vesuvian and Neapolitan identity had to include the revitalization of ancient music and dance. As you've seen, the music of the Vesuvian countrysides offered the perfect solution. Drums and tambourines, cymbals, castagnet, collective dances, and distinctly pagan rituals that found an inexplicable assonance in the mosaics and frescoes found during excavation in Vesuvian cities. So, to what extent that has the Renaissance linked to Pompeii affected the reworking of this cultural heritage? May we talk about the revitalization of a past or awareness of a past that in some ways is still alive? The discovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum undoubtedly increases and reinforces a cultural system already alive in the area. The rites, practice, and cults of the rural matrix prove it. In Naples, as you see here, a complex and dynamic dialectics develops between two realities that actively communicate and interact with extremely interesting hybridization phenomena. A cultured part that reconstructed its own identity by assimilating styles, languages, forms of the ancient world to celebrate and emulate the past, but also a popular part that already possessed those ancient codes, language, and forms, and soon becomes a model for the cultural part. There is a continuous reassembly of the cultural system in order to keep what is there alive, a common historical deep guaranteed by archaeological excavation and another form of continuity. Rediscovery was certainly an important fact, whose an intrinsic value is evident. Less evident is the impetus that archaeological excavation have given to the rediscovery of the cultural tradition of Vesuvian area. We can say that the rediscovery of ancient Vesuvian series is not only functional, but has also given new impetus and new historical depth to cultural expression that had never been dismissed as a living founding practice of Vesuvian rural societies. It legitimized them to the aristocracy and turned them into a model to be naturally integrated. Reconstructing the dialectics between persistence and rupture, rediscovery, and hybridization helps to better understand musical phenomena in their complexity and diachronic depth, and above all, the musical phenomenon as a cultural memory, central element around which the identity of Vesuvian society revolves. Here, some photos took during some rituals, always in Pompeii, in the countryside, countryside there, and maybe some videos. I don't know if it's yes, it works. Maybe no. Oh, okay, maybe some, but anyway, some photos took always here in near Pompeii with all the instruments you see, and well, anyway, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for the timing and punctual of your show presentation. If there is any question, please. Yes, please, Daniela.
Thank you, that's so interesting. I'm wondering about this, the guy in the blue raincoat on your slide, what he is playing, because this looks like a double recorder.
Oh, sorry. This?
Yes, yeah.
Is
is a typical double flute, now typical of the region of Vesuvius, or in the northern territory of Pompeii, above all in Somma Vesuviana, a small village, one of the most important villages for our music. And this example, this flute has 100 years.
Okay, so is that, do you know if that's related at all to the aulos, or is it independent?
We are not, well, we are, I'm so sorry that the video doesn't work, because this is very important for us. We can say this, I don't know, but it's interesting that we still use this, this kind of instrument. Here, not here, the first photo, we are in Cume, the Greek city, you know, the first Greek city in Magna Graecia, and we still play this instrument. I cannot prove a continuation, but this is the question. Is this a continuation, a revitalisation? Why we still use this instrument, and why there? Now we are working on literary sources, and we can reconstruct since 16th century. So it's a good question. But now we are not. It's not possible to say yes. It's a loss. It's not a loss. The organological the organological difference is enormous. But we now not. But we had some instrument like a loss. Now not. It's only flute, double flute, or something like that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your presentation. Just a consideration, a methodological consideration. And I think that we should be very, very careful in consider together, and put together all this output, all these issues that you showed, because for example, the first pictures you showed are something completely idealized. And even Lady Hamilton, the attitude of Lady Hamilton, we have not to forget that Hamilton put together a big collection of vases, and so it is a completely different concept there, I think. So I feel, I don't, yes, we should, I think that we should be very careful in put all this all together, just this.
Oh, thank you. For to talk about Lady Hamilton, it's interesting now we are read and study the documents she wrote in Naples, and we know that she organized at Palazzo Sessa in Naples, one of the ambassador residents, a particular kind of party with the peasants, because she wanted the tarantella of the region of Naples. So we know she dances this kind of dances, and we know she saw the Vesuvian frescoes, above all these of Villa di Cicerone, so-called Villa Cicerone. Of course, Sir William Hamilton was one of the most important antiquarians in the Kingdom of Naples, and yes, she was Medea, she was Hebe, she was Sibyl. She was not only a bacchante of Pompeii, absolutely, but she, I can say, was involved into this cultural phenomenon, Pompeian cultural phenomenon. She was the protagonist, and we have a lot of sources. I'm so sorry because I cut my I can say my speech for a lot of reasons, but we now found a lot of sources about these things. So yes, it's a cultural, a Greek and Roman, some Greek and Roman perception, but it's focused on Pompeian territory and Napolitan modern music, traditional music.
Yes, but even this popular tradition you can find are very common across the Mediterranean. So I would be very careful
doctor in Liège, and she has just finished discussed her dissertation in a few months ago, and now she will present her paper about Girolamo Mei. Yeah, Girolamo Mei and the legacy of the ancient musical past.
Hello everyone, and first of all, please excuse me, I am not very confident in English, and I hope to be understandable. My paper today is based on my doctoral thesis, which I recently defended, in co-tutorship between the universities of Liège in Belgium and Bologna in Italy. As part of this work, I produced a critical edition of Girolamo Mei's treatise, De Modis Musicis Antiquorum, accompanied by a first French translation. So it's this treatise that I am going to talk about, but before all, I will say a few words about his author. Girolamo Mei was born in Florence in 1519. In his youth, he received a serious classical education from the philologist Piero Vettori, who involves him in several of his editorial works, in particular on tragedies by Aeschylus and Euripides. In 1559, Mei moved to Rome, where he lived until his death, and in Rome he had access to numerous public and private libraries, especially the Vatican Library, and he then began a hunt for manuscripts of Greek musical theory. The 4 books of the De Modis, written between 1566 and 1573, are the result of this colossal research. The dedicatee was Piero Vettori himself, which whom Mei kept in touch by letter throughout his life. The treatise can be considered the first systematic study of Greek musical modes, what the Greek calls tonoi. To also clarify a few more general points, it should be remembered that during the Middle Ages, Greek musical theory was known in Western Europe almost through the Latin compilation offered by Boethius in his De Institutione Musica. From the 15th century onwards, in Italy, authors such as Ptolemy, Aristoxenus, Aristides Quintilian, and many others began to be gradually rediscovered, initially through Latin translation. Mei's aim to propose a systematic study of this musicographic corpus based on Greek manuscripts was absolutely unprecedented at this time. Finally, let's also remember that this corpus of theoretical sources on music was the only way to access the musical heritage of the ancients at a time when hardly any musical fragments had yet been rediscovered. As you probably know, Mei was the first to rediscover the hymns of Misomedes of Crete, which Vincenzo Galilei published in his Dialogo della musica antica e moderna in 1581. For a long time, these pieces were the only known ancient compositions, but they didn't attract much attention either from Mei or from Galilei. In his treatise and in his letters, Mei reaffirmed several times his objective, which was to reconstruct a kind of truth about ancient music. At the start of his research, he wrote these words to the I had believed more than twice that I had to give up in wanting to revive the truth, and I swear to you that I have spent more than 10 nights without sleep about these jackdaws. The prologue of the De Modis reads as follows: because I thought you would be very grateful, Vettori, it is with the greatest pleasure that I have undertaken to set out all this research into musical modes. How many of what nature were they among the ancients? By what characteristics were they distinguished, but also what was their use? All these elements have come down to us in a very obscure and uncertain way, on the one hand because time has covered them with rust, and on the other because the men of our time who have tackled them have not delved into the subject with the appropriate method, which we shall show. In these few lines, Mei defines 3 main issues. how many and of what nature were the ancient modes, by what characteristics were they distinguished, and what was their use. Through his study, Mei also wants to demonstrate that modern theorists have not studied these topics adequately. He doesn't hesitate to state a little further that they have ruined the musical thought of the ancients, to borrow his very words. From a methodological point of view, this prologue obviously raises a number of questions. What memory of the ancient Greek musical past does Mei contribute to reconstructing, or to position oneself between the author's purely descriptive posture facing his sources and a more speculative approach that lets his subjectivity shine through? In an attempt to get a better understanding of the way in which Mei thinks his quest for truth about ancient music and integrates it into a more personal reflection, I propose in the following to examine a few extracts from his treatise. A first observation that emerges from reading the Demodis concerns Mei's method. As a faithful disciple of Vettori, Mei devoted himself to a diligent textual criticism of his sources. I have chosen 3 examples in order to show that Mei's research for truth can be observed, first of all, on a purely philological level. I briefly skim through their contents without reading them in full. In the first, Mei is surprised by a certain confusion in a passage by Aristides Quintilian. He doesn't hesitate to state that in all the codices he had seen, this passage is undoubtedly full of many errors. The second example revolves around a more lexical argument. It concerns the adjectives plagal and authentic used in the medieval modal theory. Mei denounces the ancient pseudo-legacy of these terms that the ancient Greek didn't use because they go back to a later Byzantine musical theory. Finally, the third example concerns the dubious attribution of a harmonic introduction, generally known today as written by a certain Cleonides, but in manuscripts the work is sometimes attributed to Euclid, and this attribution was commonly accepted at the time of Mei, who was one of the first to question it. These 2 examples testify the Mei's philological method. In the rest of this presentation, I propose to pay particular attention to 2 passages of the Demodis where Mei's philological criticism has more specific repercussions on his representation of ancient music. The first passage concerns the 48th musical problem of the Pseudo-Aristotle. As it's well known, the problems are a vast collection of questions and answers on various themes, of which the 19th section deals specifically with music. The Aristotelian authorship of the whole corpus generally is no longer accepted these days, but Mei on these times never adopted it. The 48th problem is entitled Why Tragedy Choruses Sing Neither in Hypodorian nor Hypophrygian Harmony. I shall confine myself here to presenting an English translation of the problem. To briefly summarize the content, the author of the problem distinguishes between 2 types of harmony. On the one hand, those that are proper to action because of their grandiose and more static character. On the other hand, those that have a more sadder and tearful character. He associates the former with the characters on stage, who personify the heroes. The latter, on the other hand, would be more suited to the chorus, which represents ordinary mortals. Since Hypodorian and Hypophrygian both belong to the first category of action harmonies, the author concludes that they are not suitable for the chorus. This problem particularly intrigued Mei, who devoted a long section to it in the 4th book of the Demodis. His commentary on it goes in two directions. In the first direction, without much surprise, is purely philological. Mei had the idea of comparing the 48th problem with a passage in the 8th book of the Politics where Aristotle deals specifically with music. In the 48th problem, Mei is surprised that the descriptions of Hypodorian and Hypophrygian coincide with those for Dorian and Phrygian in the Politics. This comparison leads him to consider either a copyist error in the textual establishment of the problem, either a particular meaning of the prefix hypo, which here would not designate the real Hypodorian and Hypophrygian, but rather modes that have a R suboliant in Latino of Dorian and Phrygian. We can point out that this issue concerning the textual establishment of the 48th problem is reflected today in most modern editions. Without going into the purely philological details, some modern editors have joined Mei's reasoning. Beyond this philological aspect, a second implication of this 48th problem can be seen in Mei's perception of ancient music dramaturgy. As the passage in question is rather long, I will limit myself to describing the main points. As we have seen, the author of the 48th problem postulates that different harmonies were reserved for the chorus and for the actors on stage. From that point, Mei deduces that Greek tragedies were sung and set to music in their entirety, both in the choral parts and in the actors' interventions. The questions of whether ancient Greek tragedy was entirely sung or whether the singing was limited to the choral parts was a real concern for the humanists during the Renaissance. Although the second alternative was more popular, Mei was a fervent defender of the first. To support his thesis, Mei used this time a passage from the introduction of the Poetics. In this passage, Aristotle distinguishes three means of imitating human action: the logos, i.e. the text, the harmonia, a melodic dimension in this context, and the rhythmos. I will return to this concept later. Some arts, he had used only one of the three means, while others combined them simultaneously or alternatively. Putting together the evidence offered by the 48th problem and Aristotle Poetics, Mei concludes that the Greek melic genres, tragedy, comedy, satyr play, and dithyrambs, were the only imitative arts that employ together a textual dimension, the logos, a musical dimension, the harmonia, and even dance in choral parts, the rhythmos, that Mei fully assimilates here with dance. However, Mei makes a distinction between the dithyrambs, which would use continuously the three means, and the three dramatic genres, in which rhythmos would only be present in certain choral parts. Needless to say, Mei goes a step further than Aristotle text. In short, by combining a single text with a single melody and rhythm, Greek tragedy represented for Mei the perfection of ancient music through its balance of the three Aristotelian imitative means. According to him, the monodic feature of ancient music was also the key of its wonderful virtues on the human soul. The other side of this argument is well known. Mei was an ardent opponent of the polyphonic music of his time, which he criticized for no longer being able of producing the same marvelous effects on the human soul as that of the ancients. This assertion is at the heart of his letters with Vincenzo Galilei in the years following the writing of the De Modis, in which Mei particularly develops this thesis. There is no need to go back over the well-known consequences of this monodic thesis on the Florentine musical landscape of the late 16th century and on the development of the first operas. This monodic truth, as it might be called, seemed in any case to have delivered Mei from his earlier insomnia when he wrote to Vettori, I have seen and read many ancient and modern writers on this subject, and today I find myself in this matter so resolute that I would hardly dare say I have found the bottom and consequently the truth. I always mean that of the ancients and of science, not of practice. In this presentation, I insisted on Mei's philological method. Whenever he had the opportunity, he compares several manuscripts of the same author, considers copyist errors, or discusses the attribution of a text. Sometimes, in a rather acrobatic way, Mei tries to establish links between his different sources, as we have seen with when he relates the 48th problem to Aristotle Politics on the one hand and to the Poetics on the other. Readers of his treatise might be surprised, however, by the fact that Mei, in his sometimes highly complex technical presentations, never considers the slightest practical implication of his theories on the musical practice of his time. I have not had the opportunity here to go into the technical details of Mei's discourse about musical modes. Mei was the first modern theorist to show clearly the differences between the ancient Greek tonoi, defined by an identity of pitch, and the modes of his time, which were reduced to simple octave forms with no specific pitch. By taking a diachronic look at ancient musical theory, Mei was able to highlight for the first time the divergences between the Aristotelian Ptolemaic and Boeotian modes, and then to show how the modern ones diverge from them. However, Mei's presentation appears to be a highly abstract construction with no implication outside the sphere of pure musical theory. The same can be said of Mei's discussion of the ancient genres, which runs through a large part of Book 1. After pointing out the divergences in the number of genres recognized by ancient theorists, Mei carefully describes their distribution according to Aristoxenus, Ptolemy, and Boethius. At no point do this laborious calculation lead to the slightest consideration on the modern use of temperaments. The theory practice caesura inherent in the sciences of the medieval quadrivium, to which music belonged, is still very marked in Mei's approach. His lack of interest in musical practice is moreover justified by his initial profession of re-establishing a truth about ancient music. This guideline is again asserted in the extract that we have just examined. When Mei writes, I always mean that of the ancient and of science, not of practice. In his letters to Galilei, Mei never misses an opportunity to remind his friend that musical practice doesn't interest him. I'll pay a particular attention to two passages. The first one says, to the question you ask me whether I believe that another consonant musical genre and other types of consonances and other order and other forms of modes and new ways of singing can be found among the ancients that are not known of moderns, I think I can sufficiently satisfy you since they have been discussed at length above, and for this reason there is no need to reply further. It is easy to deduce from these few lines that Galilei had previously asked me about the musical theory of the ancients with the aim of inspiring other modern musical practices relating to the use of genres, consonances, and modes. The door that Galilei wanted to open to a dialogue on musical practice was immediately closed by Mei, who quickly concluded that there is no need to reply further on these points. With the second extract, written some years later, Galilei may have obtained a more detailed justification from his correspondent. I answer you that the sciences have a different end and proceed differently from the arts. The sciences seek the truth of all the accidents and properties of their subject and their causes, having for their end the entire truth of their knowledge without more, and the arts have for their end the work which is very different from understanding. Without reading them in their entirety or systematically translating them into English, here are a few more examples in which Mei reminds Galilei that he couldn't read music, sing, dance, or play a musical instrument, and that his only goal was to study the musical theory of the ancients. Vincenzo Galilei, as is well known, played a key role in the transmission of Mei's ideas within the Camerata de' Bardi in the late 16th century Florence. In the history of music, the two Florentines are often presented in pairs. In this presentation, I have deliberately chosen to highlight the differences that animated their respective approaches. In the prologue of his Demodis, we remember that Mei set out to remove the rust accumulated over the centuries on ancient musical modes. The way he looks at these sources before being that of a musicologist or music theorist is above all that of a philologist. On reading the Demodis, Mei's relationship with a philologist like Piero Vettori becomes much more obvious than the traditional one with a musician like Vincenzo Galilei. The Demodis is the result of a colossal hunt for manuscripts in the Roman libraries, never undertaken by any terrorist before Mei. At the time, Greek musicographic texts were still unpublished in their original language. On certain points, Mei sometimes anticipated the conclusions reached by theorists several centuries after him. The few extracts that we have examined shed light on the mechanisms by which Mei transformed and recuperated the ancient musical legacy. The Demodis is an invaluable document for understanding the transmission and appropriation of the ancient musical legacy during the Renaissance, and I hope that a first translated edition will make it more widely known within the scientific community. At a time when no ancient musical sound seemed to have survived, Mei's treatise allows us to observe how ancient music was received and perceived, sometimes reinvented, and how these representations confronted with modern musical models contributed to the construction of a European musical identity in the modern period. I will now leave Mei with the final word. It is by no means easy for anyone to determine the truth. It requires assiduous training and scrupulous attention to detail if we wish to devote ourselves to this prestigious task of investigating the truth. Thank you very much for your attention.
Any questions? Thank you, Mathilde, for your very important contribution. And yes, no, but I will give the word. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. So I'm baffled to hear that May did not know musical notation. Did he use ancient terminology then to speak about the Mesomedes hymns, for example? What was his terminology?
The terminology in Latin is nota.
In general, so he used ancient terminology.
May I? So, for the first time, Girolamo Mei copied Mesomede hymns in his treatise, the Modis. And he was a philologist, not a musician, not a composer, and so. What comes out from the dissertation by Mathilde is the completely different role between Vincenzo Galilei and Girolamo Mei in relation of the perspective. The first one was a great philologist who occasionally composed this treatise, but who devoted all his life to this treatise at the end.
there's a sentence such as quibus notis distinguerentur or something like that. In the text you showed at the start and at the end about the subject of his work, there's a sentence, a phrase in his program, quibus notis distinguerentur or something like that. And this was translated by which characteristics they would be distinguished. Are you sure that it doesn't mean by which notes, by which musical pitches they are distinguished, which I think is an established use since Boethius from nota?
In italiano è possibile tradurre un sì?
La domanda che ti ha fatto il professor Hagel è sul primo testo che hai mostrato e in particolare su una tua traduzione dall'italiano all'inglese. Penso che sia tua, non di Palisca.
E questo?
The first one, il primo. Questo, il primo, è l'incipit del De Morris.
Okay.
E ti ha chiesto sul verbo quibusque notis interseding oscerentur, che tu hai tradotto by what characteristics were they distinguished?
La traduzione in inglese non l'ho fatto io perché ho fatto la traduzione in francese e dopo per questa presentazione ho utilizzato Deeper dal francese verso l'inglese, infatti nell'edizione sarà in francese, non sarà questa traduzione in inglese solo per oggi.
Ecco, so, did you understand? Yes. Of course, this English translation was not accurate as her French translation, and it was put only in these slides. And she did a completely different translation about for this passage.
Which is?
I don't know. Qual è la traduzione? Cioè il punto è, hai considerato...
in francese penso che ho utilizzato marchio e caratteristiche.
Quibusque notis interseding oscerentur, l'hai tradotto con...
Notis, con marchi e caratteristiche, penso. Non so più, devo verificare nella traduzione, ma è anche la parola che lui utilizza per dire le notazioni.
Sì, infatti il problema è proprio questo.
Al momento in cui parla di Alipios, utilizza nota come...
Certo.
Ma qui è un prologo, quindi non è ancora molto tecnico come...
Ecco, sì, questa è la risposta. Cioè nel prologue, in the prologue, May doesn't use the technical words, he uses nota not in a technical acception, but in a more general way. Instead, in the course of the treatise, where he speaks about Alipius, he uses notes in the technical meaning. Okay. So, any other questions? May I translate for somebody else? Okay. So, thank you again, Mathilde.